American Farm Bureau is our national organization, and part of your membership dues go to support that organization that works very hard in our behalf. It is what I call the secret sauce to this organization. They have professional staffs in Washington that look after our interests, not just daily but hourly. And they're in the agencies, they're in the White House, they're in the offices that make a difference. And having a Washington presence is important to every single person that's in this auditorium and every farmer in our country. And having a well-funded, well-organized, well-run American Farm Bureau is extremely important. And doesn't mean that they're going to influence the North Carolina delegation like North Carolina Farm Bureau does, but they provide the national voice that farmers need, and they do a really good job at it. And as the second largest state farm bureau, it is our pleasure to invite and welcome the Executive Vice President of American Farm Bureau, Dale Moore, to the podium. And during Dale's 35 years in Washington, Dale has served in a number of roles with American Farm Bureau in the areas of public policy, lobbying, and economic analysis. Prior to joining American Farm Bureau in 2011, Dale served in several important ag legislative roles, including the Chief of Staff at USDA, a very important job, Legislative Director for the House Ag Committee. So he understands how the Ag Committee and all those issues swirl in the Congress. He started his congressional tenure as a legislative assistant in the office of then Representative Pat Roberts from Kansas. And he also served as the legislative director for the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. Dale knows his way around that city. He's worked there for a long time. He's got a lot of insight and wisdom as to how things work. He's a great resource for us as we work on your behalf in Washington. And I'd like to welcome Dale to the podium to bring us some good news from Washington.
No pressure, Peter. Bring good news from Washington. Do I have 5 minutes to redo my speech a little bit here? Hello, bosses. Thank you for the opportunity. I was asking Mr. Wooten last night how much time I had, and he said, well, take what time you need. And I said, well, I've got a whole bunch of nice things just to say about you. And he goes, well, we need to cut back on that, so I've limited that to the first 20 minutes. I will tell you, and I know you said no on this, but I'm hoping everybody picked up a copy of this. Dean Linton and I were talking about it. And if you needed to sum up Larry Wooten, it's right there in the headline, the leader. And that's one of the things that I had the privilege when I first started. Mr. Wooten was one of the first board members that came to meet me. I started at Farm Bureau 8 years ago. I grew up in a little town in southwest Kansas. Like most of you, I'm from a small town. It's about half the size of this room. Had 9 kids in my high school class. My mother was my 6th, 7th, and 8th grade English, math, and geography teacher, and also, yes, therapy works, let me tell you. She also was on the Women's Leadership Committee in Kansas for 43 years. So my first experience when I started with Mr. Roberts was to put together policy papers and do the kinds of things that an agriculture legislative assistant does. And Mom called and said, we're getting ready for convention. We're going through the resolutions process. Could you send out some of Pat's policy papers that you've put together for him? And I said, well, I'll check. The boss said yes. put them in the mail. About a month later, my chief of staff calls me out and he said, I opened this by mistake, and he holds up a big envelope. And in that envelope, I said, well, that's my mom's handwriting. He goes, yes. And I pulled it out, and it was all of my policy papers. They had been corrected. And there was a little booklet in there that was sort of the mid-'80s version of Idiot's Guide to Grammar. And it said, your grammar has gotten atrocious. Do not lose this time. So, not that I've gotten any better. Mr. Wooten, like you, my degree is in animal science. I also have a PhD in BS, and that kind of works well. Yes. My wife introduced me to her pastor. My wife is from Southern Maryland, so she went to school in Kansas. She's the reason I ended up back on the East Coast, where they don't have a lot of demand for guys with cowboy skills, and got to work for Mr. Roberts. So she got to live in Maryland. I drove to Kansas every morning to work, and one of the joys of that was just getting to know her family, which has been in Southern Maryland since the late 1700s. And when Pastor Bill asked, so Bill, how does a guy with an animal science degree get a job working on Capitol Hill? And that was when she told me, or told him that, well, he's got his PhD in BS. And I reminded him, he started laughing. He said, is that accurate? And I said, well, my animal science professor said the same thing, because I worked for him on the college ranch. And Dr. Bill, I don't know, I'm sure you don't remember, but I was privileged a couple of times to come to North Carolina on the tobacco tour that the House Agriculture Committee, Mr. Hatcher and Mr. Rose and crew would have us come down to try and educate us. And for a Kansas kid, I learned about tobacco listening to you try to straighten some of us out that came from other parts of the world. Mr. Wooten, thank you. Thank you for your leadership, and Ms. Laura, too. As I know, when I look back just on the 8 years that I've been working with the American Farm Bureau, Larry Wooten's been a leader for us, for all of us in the nation, not just you all here in North Carolina. He's on the USDA Policy Advisory Committee. He has served, since Bob Stallman put it in place, he has served as the chair of American Farm Bureau's Finance Committee, helping us carefully marshal those hard-earned dues dollars that you all share to give us resources to work with on your behalf in Washington, D.C. Thank you for jumping on the airplanes. Every time something pops up, I always kind of smiled when I would call Miss Linda, or she would call me and say, we're going to be in town, there's a little issue we're going to talk about. And I think virtually every time that you've been in town, you take time to stop by and not just visit with Mr. Duvall or Mr. Stallman before him, but us at the staff level. That is very much appreciated. And I thank you for raising a profile on key issues. I know the Justice touched on it. One of the things that we have seen is that Mr. Wooten, Peter, and the crew came to town and gave us a heads up on this lawsuit that you all were fighting here in North Carolina. And one thing that folks were looking at is like, well, North Carolina's got some pretty stringent, right to farm laws. And we saw very quickly, you all saw very quickly, just how those kind of got torn apart by some, think of the kitchen words. My granddad knocked me on my backside one time when I thought I was old enough to talk like he talked, and got a lesson in kitchen words and shop words. So I'm not sure how to describe in polite company the folks that came to town to sue hog farmers. But you bringing and raising that profile, giving us at American Farm Bureau and a number of other groups a chance to weigh in on some of those issues where we could help, that was one thing. But the other thing it's done too is help raise awareness all across the country in a number of different states who also thought they had pretty stringent, pretty tightly drawn right to farm laws, and try to prevent this from happening in the future. One of the things that we've seen, and I need to mention this too, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about trade later, but thank you for your leadership on the tobacco front. One of the first calls I got when this tariff war with China started was the grave impact it had on tobacco farmers. China essentially overnight quit buying U.S. tobacco. And I don't care how many trade assistance packages you put together, how many different ways you try to help farmers across the nation. When your market goes away like that one went away, I don't care if it got fixed tomorrow. I don't know how we get back to where we were before all of that happened. And I also have to thank you to a number of the North Carolina folks, and I'm not going to embarrass myself by inadvertently leaving somebody out, but the leadership you send to Washington for the Women's Leadership Committee, Young Farmers and Ranchers, promotion and education, all the different companies and groups and parts that we work with. I got to sit in on the insurance company's meeting yesterday and listening to Janet, my counterpart with the AIC, and getting to visit and learn about all the things that North Carolina contributes to what we do, again, not just here, but all across the nation. Now, what are some of those issues? I'm going to start with one that is a relatively new initiative. It's not really legislative, but we are working with Congress. It's not really regulatory, but we're working with USDA, and that's on farm stress. One of the things that I know, again, growing up in a small town, you bang up your elbow, you get knocked in the head, or, cow steps on your foot. Nobody thinks the thing, you say, I need to go to the doctor, get this checked out because, I busted something up. But what happens when you're facing stress, when that stress is so high that you need help? You've got mental health issues that you've got to deal with. That's just not something in small towns you talk about. That's not where you go and reach out and say, so where do I go to get help on this? You just don't talk about it. So one of the things that we've been doing, the board has given, the finance committee approved this, the executive committee approved it, the full board approved it, gave us the resources, and we're working with the farm credit system. We're working with the National Farmers Union, a group with which typically on most policy issues we're probably about 75 degrees apart on what we agree on. But on this one, we're lockstep together. We're working with Secretary Perdue and his team. We're working with Colin Peterson and Mike Conaway on the House Ag Committee, Pat Roberts, Debbie Stabenow on the Senate Agriculture Committee, working to put together a process not to become experts ourselves on mental health and rural stress, but providing the resources, training the trainers. And at convention, at the AFBF convention here in January, we're going to have a meeting, front-running, and before that, a training session. A couple folks from each state get trained to go back and help right down to the local level, right down to the county level, help train folks to recognize that stress and also where to point folks for resources. Because again, it doesn't matter what issues we are working on, trade, waters, all the different things that are going on, ag labor. If we're not taking care of the men and women that I work for all across this nation, we're missing the boat. So thank you for that leadership as well. Now, some of the basic issues that work on, I learned this from Mr. Roberts when I started with him in 1985. One of the rules that he told me, I didn't think I was whining. He said I was whining one day, and I said, so boss, why can't this process work more efficient? This government process needs to run more like a business. And he looked at me and said, oh, you poor, sweet child. When was the last time you read the Constitution? When was the last time you read the Declaration of Independence? And I said, well, I had to read it in high school. And he goes, go get a copy and read it again. He said, we had a very efficient form of government. His name was King George. We didn't particularly like the efficiency he brought to the process, so we made some changes. Our founding fathers put together a process, and when they put it together, they wanted it to become, my interpretation of his words, it's a rock, paper, scissors kind of game that goes on all the time. And I don't use the word game lightly because it is very important. As the Justice pointed out, we work on things legislatively, and then we go to work on the regulatory side to make sure those agencies are trying to keep the regulations compatible with what Congress passed. And then occasionally we find ourselves, and Farm Bureau is great about working on this at both the state level and the national level. Sometimes we go to court. We go to court because that is the one remedy we've got to go back to either the legislative branch or the regulatory branch and say, look, you all aren't quite getting this right. That's one of the things that as we look through these issues, I know, let's start off with waters of the United States. Just this past week or so, EPA Administrator Wheeler sent the new Clean Water Rule over to OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, for clearance. That bill replaces, we've already repealed, but will replace the waters of the U.S. rule that the Obama administration put in place. A rule that, frankly, when you peel back all the layers and looked at all 111,000 words that were in that initial proposed regulation, essentially was a massive land use planning regulation. And one of its biggest impacts would have been on farmers and ranchers. So Administrator Wheeler is working that bill forward and hopes to have that signed around the first part of the year. That's one of the things that has been so wonderful too, is the great work that you all have done at the grassroots level. And I know we've seen this talked about. Peter mentioned it, and I just want to reiterate it. When I worked for Mr. Roberts, he obviously represented Kansas. And one of the things that he told me early on, he said, Dale, American Farm Bureau is going to call you and tell you, here's what's important to Farm Bureau. And as soon as you're off the phone, he said, I want you to reach out and talk to Kansas's version of Peter or Linda or Jay or whoever it happens to be and say, here's what American Farm Bureau wants, but what do you all want? And they would give me that feedback. And then as soon as I got off the phone with that, he said, now, here's the dozen people around the state, grassroots farmers and ranchers that I want you to call. And the upshot is that if those grassroots farmers and ranchers agreed with what Kansas Farm Bureau wanted and agreed with what American Farm Bureau wanted, then the work that I'm doing now would move forward in his eyes. And that's what I want to tell you. When I'm going in visiting with your senators, visiting with your elected House members, I can give them all the facts and figures. But unless they hear from you, and when they hear from you, which you all are great about doing, it doesn't mean whit to them, because you're the ones that matter to them back home. One of the things we talk about a lot is trade. And I would love to tell you that everything is bright and rosy on trade. However, there are some bright spots. We are continue to hear that President Trump has indicated that he is not going to move forward, at least as of now, on the proposed December tariff increases that he was proposing for China. China, in return, has indicated that they're going to back off a notch or two and may again start buying certain commodities, particularly soybeans. We also know that however that works out, and again, back to the tobacco issue, I don't know when that gets resolved. And that's one of those sides of where no matter how bright a spot, how positive things look, there are some things that are going to take a long, long time to get repaired. One of the things we do appreciate, and we've said this to both the President Duvall has shared this with him. We've also had the conversation with Secretary Perdue as he and Mr. Duvall visit quite frequently. We appreciate the trade assistance package, the trade mitigation assistance that comes out. It is not a solution. It's a temporary assistance that helps us get through these rough times. And I think it's no more clear than when you look at when you take away the trade assistance, you take away the farm programs, net farm income is half of what it was just 6 years ago, half, down in the 60 billion range. Now you see the headlines like, well, it's up in the high 80s, low 90s now, according to USDA data. But a big chunk of that are the payments that are coming through the trade assistance and through the farm programs on that side. We're also dealing with the fact that Mother Nature has not been the most cooperative business partner the last few years, and we've got to sort that out. One of the bright spots is Japan. It's touched on that we've made some progress. We've gotten back in particularly on beef and pork and a few of the other commodities. A long way to go before we get back to where we would have been had we stayed in the Trans-Pacific Partnership process. We can discuss that all day long, but the reality is we've actually made some progress with Japan. The Japanese government just this past week or so agreed to that first phase of it. So we get that implemented and rolling, and then hopefully we get into the next 2 or 3 months of the new year, more negotiations will start to talk about some of those other commodities that did not fare as well. We're also looking at the U.S., Mexico, and Canada trade agreement. Now, 4 weeks ago, Speaker Pelosi said it was imminent. And Washington, D.C. is one of those towns where having a good English background, a grammar background is helpful because you've got to parse every word. There's about 19 different variations of what the word soon means. It's either tomorrow or sometime before the next November in an even-numbered year. Imminent is usually shorter than that. That means either tomorrow or maybe by March. So we're hopeful that we are making progress. Now, one of the big things that occurred, 2 big things actually, just in the last 48 hours. Over the weekend, the United States and Mexico reached agreement on some of the changes to the agreement relative to Mexico that Ambassador Lighthizer and his team had negotiated with Speaker Pelosi and her team. And that is good news because you make a change in a trade agreement, then you've got to go all the way back to go with the countries that you've negotiated with, because Mexico had already approved this. That's positive news. The other positive news is that a gentleman named Trumka, not Trump, but Trumka, T-R-U-M-K-A, who is the president of AFL-CIO, one of the unions, big unions, had been holding back on his opinion beyond "I don't like it" relative to USMCA. And we just got word here over the last, again, 24 hours, the President Trumka has indicated that AFL-CIO may not be wholly supportive of USMCA, but they backed off their lack of support and indicating that they're not going to oppose USMCA. And that is a big deal. That helps us work with Speaker Pelosi to get this process moving forward. And we're hopeful, I mean, it's kind of a long shot that we're going to get that done next week, but those of you who are fond of throwing up Christmas wishes and asking the good Lord for some help, that would be one I would ask that you put on your list. Also this week, we are likely to see, probably as early as tomorrow, maybe on Thursday, the ag labor bill come up. This is an issue that, one of those lessons I learned from Mr. Roberts, Dale, if you pick the right issues, you never have to learn new things, because you're going to work on it over and over and over and over again. Ag labor is one of those. I've been working on this 1985. In a staff meeting, I said, can I have an issue of my own? You know, I've gotten a couple calls about this ag labor thing. Can I have that? In the chorus of yeses from the congressman, from the chief of staff, from the senior ag guy, I didn't realize at the time what a gift I was getting on trying to sort that issue out. Zoe Lofgren, who is the chairwoman on the Judiciary Committee in the House, has put together a package. The American Farm Bureau Board has met twice on this when her package came out. The first time we indicated that we would not support, the board indicated and voted unanimously not to support that bill. Now, we didn't say we were going to oppose it. We didn't say we were going to try to kill it. But we opposed it basically because the one positive it had in it from our perspective, maybe a positive and 1/10, had a pathway to legal status for the current workforce. And we have many, many folks across the country who've been working on farms and ranches for, decades in some cases, multiple generations even in some cases, and having a pathway to get them to a legal status and whatever else gets worked out is pretty critical. Second part of that, too, is we were working to get year-round access, and that there's a year-round H-2A component to this. The reason I say it's only about a 1/10 of a solution on year-round is because they've got a 10,000 cap, visa cap on those 10,000 cap on the H-2A workers. That is not going to work. You can suck that up in dairy alone, and we've got a number of other commodity sectors that need year-round assistance, so we're continuing to work on that. Now, the board did give us direction. We don't support the bill as it was introduced. Keep working to try and improve it. And I will give Ms. Lofgren and her fellow co-sponsors, there's 26 Republicans that co-sponsored, some credit because they have made some adjustments. Not enough, because in the second go-round, when the board looked at it a second time, 2 or 3 weeks later, we determined that, again, we're backing off from oppose the bill, not actively opposing, but went to support. But we can, Farm Bureau is not going to support the bill until we get some key things. Those key things, there still needs to be some adjustment on the wages. Wages, I know this is something that Mr. Wooten and everybody have visited with just here in North Carolina, but a number of states have talked to us about how the adverse effect wage rate has just gotten so out of hand and how that's impacting producers. And one of the things that President Duvall had indicated to Ms. Lofgren and to Mr. Newhouse, the Republican co-sponsor of the bills, said, look, you all can put all this together, but if the men and women I represent cannot afford to help, how is this going to help those workers that you're so worried about in terms of the wage rate? We're also concerned about an issue called private right of action. And the way this is drawn up, it would essentially give somebody that you may hire workers, but in their home country, they could sue you. And I cannot imagine what it would, I know what it costs in the United States, but I can't imagine the additional cost of trying to protect yourself in court in a foreign country or in some international court. So we're working to fix that. I already mentioned the cap on year-round. The other was electronic verification, or E-Verify. The grassroots policy that guides us when we work on this indicates that unless and until we get a workable ag worker visa program that protects the farmers and ranchers and their needs, we're opposed to an E-Verify system. You know, it's not like, well, we'll support E-Verify if you give us a system. It's give us a system that works, that's affordable, and then we'll support E-Verify. So we're working on that. And I do have to give some credit. Senator Tillis took time during that second board meeting to visit with the board, share his concerns, his thoughts on what he would do with us and work with us if and when this issue should get over to the Senate side. And we've continued to work with his team as we've closely monitored this markup. So this legislative action will take place on the House floor, we think, sometime this week. We've got some members lined up to offer some amendments. I do not believe that we will get to a point where we, Farm Bureau, will say we support this bill. I don't think we're going to be at a point where we're going to say we oppose it, because we need to keep this process going. If this goes down, it'll probably be another 4 or 5 years before we get this issue back up, and there's too many things we need to work on. So when I look through the past year and I look at all the ongoing advocacy that I have the privilege to work on your behalf and the team we have in Washington, Peter said a lot of very nice things about the team we have in Washington, D.C. I want to tell you, you all have got a great team here in North Carolina. I don't know how we would do our jobs without their help. Mr. Wooten, it's like I've told you, and I've told you this several times, I never get rid of old bosses, I just add new ones. So I wish your successor lots of luck, but you're still one of my bosses. Thank you, Eric. And you all are my bosses too. Thank you very much.